Okay? Our second presentation will be held by Dr. Rivka Tuval-Mashiach. She is a clinical psychologist, a senior lecturer, and the head of the clinical graduate program in the Department of Psychology and the Gender program at Bar Ilan. Currently, she is also at NATAL. She specializes in the study of narratives and life stories, especially in the context of trauma and illness. Her fields of research include trauma narratives, psychological impact of collective trauma, collective memory, trauma and gender, and identity challenges and construction in coping with trauma and illness. In her studies, she uses qualitative and mixed methodologies. She has published many articles on trauma and narratives and co-authored the book Narrative Research, Reading, Analysis, and Interpretation, together with Amir Lieblich and Tamar Zilber, and is co-editor of the book Narrative Research, Theory, Creation, and Interpretation, together with Gabriela Spector-Merzel in Hebrew. רבקה, בבקשה.
Hi, I'd like to start by saying that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to study the NATAL Unique Testimonies archive. The study of these 60 testimonies is only in its beginning, and so this presentation is a work in progress, and I welcome any comments or suggestions. In this talk, I'd like to describe... I'd like to describe some of the psychological aspects that emerged in the analysis process of this trauma testimony. Within clinical psychology, for reasons which are beyond the scope of this paper, trauma is studied today mostly in regard to the medical model, focusing on post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and its symptoms. There is very little reference to wider aspects, such as the impact of trauma on a survivor's general life and identity, including self-perception and experiences of loss and identity changes. These aspects are almost absent from the psychological research of trauma. However, as part of the growing focus on the subjective experiences of survivors, interest in narratives, and particularly trauma narratives, has largely grown in recent years. I will start with a short quote on the narrative approach in psychology by Donald Spence. Part of my sense of self depends on my being able to go backward and forward in time and weave a story about who I am, how I got that way, and where I am going. A story that is continuously nourishing and self-sustaining. Take that away from me, and I'm significantly less. In the final analysis, living only for the moment, I am not a person at all. The theory underlying the current study is the narrative theory of identity, which refers to the personal identity of each individual as a story, and views the life story as a complex expression of the narrating individual's personality. According to this theory, people infuse meaning into their lives, into the events they have experienced, and into the choices they have made through the stories they tell about themselves. As such, the life story is not only a format for telling oneself and others about one's life, but is also the means by which one's identity takes shape. On the one hand, the story expresses the identity of the narrator, and on the other, it shapes and influences the transformations of that identity. This is because it is through their stories that individuals come to know themselves or reveal themselves to others. One of the derivatives of the narrative theory is the narrative approach to therapy. According to this approach, the The healthy individual is capable of possessing a coherent, meaningful, and dynamic narrative of him or herself. Contrary, a person whose story is unavailable, flawed, or partial is prone to psychological and emotional difficulties. Howard claims that the development of identity is an issue of life story construction. Psychopathology can be seen as instances of life stories gone awry, and psychotherapy as exercises in story repair. Narrative therapy, therefore, focuses on the client's life story as the main tool for therapeutic change. Through locating those parts in the story that hinder continuity and coherence, and jointly creating an alternative story, a richer construction of one's life and identity is promoted. Traumatic events confront individuals with extreme threat and force them to cope with an unexpected, unfamiliar situation, the result of which is a difficulty to verbalize the trauma. As survivors oscillate between the need to share the traumatic experience and the need to deny and silence it. The tension between these contradictory needs creates the central dialectic of emotional trauma. Understanding the psychological processes experienced by trauma survivors pose one of the central challenges in the study of trauma. I'd like to claim that trauma breaks the natural flow of life, and this, in turn, is expressed as a rupture of the narrative. What do I mean when I speak about a rupture of the narrative? This rupture is expressed in the stories trauma survivors tell about themselves and about their lives. Wigren suggests that trauma disrupts narrative processing on two levels. At the specific level, there is a disruption in the ability to narrate the traumatic event itself. At the more general level, there is a disruption in the flow and continuity of the whole life story of the individual. In one of our previous works on trauma narratives, we suggested three aspects to consider in the narratives as a way to capture the psychological rupture. The examples under each category are described verbatim, taken from trauma survivors' narratives. The first is a disruption of continuity and coherence. This is many times expressed as though one's life were cut into two, before and after the trauma. The second aspect is the shattering of meanings, what Ronnie Janoff Bullman termed the shattering of assumptions about the world and its benevolence. The third aspect is the challenge of one's agency and self-perception as active, potent, and capable of controlling his or her life. But there is another aspect which relates to the rupture of the narrative, that which relates to the interpersonal field. I wish to make the claim that the ability or difficulty to construct a meaningful story in the aftermath of trauma depends not only in the individual's intrapsychic challenges, but also in his or her ability to share this story and communicate it to others. The trauma survivor oscillates between withdrawing from connections because of his or her fears, guilt, shame, and loneliness, to a desire to share in a desperate search for support and comfort from others. The burden of listening to a survivor's story is quite heavy. It is hard to listen to. It is repetitive, and it evokes complex emotional reactions from the audience, including fears, disgust, helplessness, and pain. It is not rare to hear from survivors that even when they do try to communicate and tell their story, they feel their stories are unwanted by the natural social network members. This break in the ability to communicate the story with others is not marginal, because it is through negotiation with others that we build our stories. We shape them, change, and refine them according to the ongoing dialogue we have with others. And although it can also be an internal dialogue with imagined people or norms, it is crucial, especially after this shattering of beliefs, self, and narrative, that real people will be involved in crediting the regaining of narrative by the survivor. The current research aims at studying trauma testimonies from the NATAL archive. This archive includes more than 60 testimonies of Israeli survivors of war, captivity, and terror attacks. We are interested in describing the main psychological challenges experienced by narrators, as well as the strategies they use to cope. Furthermore, we are interested in studying the relations between the narrative structure and quality and well-being measures using a mixed methods design. This study is as I said, is in its beginning stages now, and for the purpose of this paper, I'm focusing on 5 war and captivity trauma testimonies, which are more than 300 pages of testimony. In our analysis, we use the model we developed for the analysis of narrative text. The model suggests 2 axes of the text. Form versus content is one axis, and holistic versus categorical is the other axis. In addition to content analysis, which is the most popular and well-known method for analysis, we also used categorical form analysis and holistic form methods, which I'll shortly demonstrate. I would like to use M's testimony that we just saw a few minutes ago when Judith presented as an entry point. And I'm referring to the last scene that we just saw. The last scene is different from the previous 7 hours of documentation. It is very emotional. It brings up a topic not discussed earlier, his inabilities as a father. It tells about remorse and missing. I am sorry I could not be there for you. I am sorry I could not be the strong and stable father you needed. And it also sheds light on the purpose of bearing the testimony. I hope you can now understand why. Through this section from M's testimony that was just presented, I would like to discuss the functions of the narration. The short moving scene from M's story very vividly demonstrates how Mr. M turns to his children to ask for their understanding and empathy. Although he didn't say during the long hours of the testimony, it seems that M addresses his family, his wife and 3 children, as the recipients of his life story, hoping that if they only knew his story, they will be able to understand and hopefully to forgive. In this sense, the testimony can be conceived as a dialogue between the survivor and his surroundings, his family, friends, as well as the larger social milieu in which he lives. This dialogue was expressed in the narratives both directly, as was the case in many stories, where narrators had messages to the army, to the Ministry of Defense, to the government, but also as well in a more nuanced way, as a conversation with cultural norms. What is heroism? Who is a good soldier? Can one be both a hero and traumatized, etc.? The other function of the testimony is an internal dialogue within the narrator himself. Through narrating their whole life stories, survivors strive to gain meaning and create coherence and a sense of their lives with the trauma. I will demonstrate how this function of the testimony is achieved in what follows. The following citation is illustrating the personal function of narration. This is taken from a new book by Yoram Eshet, an Israeli professor and a former soldier who fought in the Yom Kippur War, was badly injured, and suffers from a head injury ever since. The process of my life is to discipline my distorted memories. Memory is like a gas. It fills all spaces. If there are even only 2 bits of memories, they will fill the mind. When you have million bits of distorted memories, you can't cope with it. Everything is mixed up. There is no coherent picture. It is a collage of events without sense. And the only way to deal with it is to discipline the memories, arrange them, take some out, leave some in. Such a discipline, in turn, creates meaning. By making sense of the memories, a broader picture emerges. It is interesting to know that in Hebrew, the word discipline carries two meanings, mishma'at and mashma'ut, both discipline and meaning, and these two are lost in translation. Looking in the narratives for the main challenges narrators cope with during and following the war, a main theme of locations has emerged. I termed this theme forced relocations to describe the clash between the reality and the expectations narrators had of coming back to exactly where they were before the war. An expectation which in most stories could not be materialized, forcing them to change, adapt, and relocate or find their places again within their relationships, their family, but also their body, self-perception, and well-being. Although most narrators were young adults when the war broke, many were already married, had friends, studied or held jobs before the war, and the return to the familiar was not automatic, and in many stories was not described as a smooth transition. The following are the main themes that emerge as challenges for the narrators. It is important to note that these challenges were expressed somewhat differently in different periods of life. Specifically, the narrative of the traumatic event or period, the war or captivity, brought up extreme challenges to safety and sanity. Here, I am referring to the challenges at the macro level of the more general life story and relate to the changes and relocations narrators had to make after the trauma. Now, I would like to depict several mechanisms through which I suggest narrators cope with the challenges mentioned. At this stage of analysis, it is important to know that my interest is not necessarily in the testimony's contents. That is, I'm not only looking for what narrators say about their coping, but instead I focus more on the form or formal aspects of the testimonies. It's more on how they say than what they say. The first category I'd like The first category strategy I'd like to bring up is creating continuity within the narrative. One example for this is the link one of the narrators creates between the child he was and the soldier he later became to be. When he describes his childhood at the beginning of his story, he says, "I was a very strong and resilient child. I don't know, maybe these qualities of me as a child helped me later when I was a prisoner of war." Additionally, several narrators emphasized how they went back to serve in the Army Reserves, Miluim, even though they could be released, and thus they linked their wartime identity as soldiers to later periods in life. Another strategy is linkage to other traumas. For example, identifying with Holocaust survivors. One of the most moving moments in M, the person whose testimony we just saw, one of the minutes in his testimony was when he started one of the documentation meetings with a request to tell about his experience from last week when he flew as a tourist to Berlin. And there, spontaneously, he decided to have a ceremony in the Holocaust Memorial Square. He said that during the long days of captivity, he told himself that in the Holocaust, people were in worse condition than he was, and that like them, he will survive. In this way, M connects himself with the larger community and with the Jewish chain. The three strategies of minimizing, distancing, and silence seem to serve the needs for safety, sanity, and emotional equilibrium. Minimizing refers to the tendency to describe extremely difficult experiences as moderate and shallow. Distancing refers to emphasizing facts rather than emotions, and general rather than personal descriptions. And silence serves as a marker of what cannot be said. I will illustrate these strategies in a short paragraph from one testimony in the next slide. The final strategy that emerged was that of regaining authorship. This is the ongoing struggle to gain and regain perception of oneself as agent, potent, and capable, despite the circumstances. This is expressed in the stories by the use of first-person sentences, as well as expressions of uniqueness, knowledge, and initiation on the narrator's part. This example is a short paragraph taken from one testimony. It describes the moments when the army post was conquered by Syrian soldiers in the Yom Kippur War. This scene describes the last minutes before they were surrendered. The situation was that the Israelis were in a bunker in Ramat Golan, surrounded by Syrian soldiers. There was a feeling of being surrounded by the enemy, and we are in a situation of not nice. We can't protect ourselves. We're trapped in the post. They told Gadi in the network, we're trying to reach you. As long as you're inside the post, you're safe. But then a grenade was thrown in, and it made a lot of dust and suffocation. It was not comfortable. Some people tried to use a ventilator. It didn't work. There was a very difficult feeling. At a certain point, electricity shut down too, and it became a total darkness. There is no way to describe. Exactly like deep down the ground and with nothing. And then the guys started to spread away in the tunnels. I didn't know where I'm going. I went, I have no idea where to. Really, I don't have a clue where I went. I don't know if others knew. Others served there for a year or two, so they knew all the tunnels and passes. I knew nothing, where I am, where I'm going to. What we can see, I'm showing the same paragraph, but now I'm just marking the strategies. When someone says there was a feeling instead of I was afraid, he makes it more general. This is impersonal. It is as if it is objective, so he distances himself from the experience. Minimizing is saying about a terrible experience that it is not nice. Lo na'im, in Hebrew, lo na'im. This is an understatement because it was a terrible experience, and you can see that it is deteriorating. It was not nice, and then it was not comfortable, and then it was very difficult feeling. Silencing is exemplified by two strategies. One is the use of negation, saying no instead of what it is indeed, using the negative mode, or being unable to describe, and you can see it in the sentence that he cannot finish. There is no way to describe. And if you read the end of the sentence, for me it gave the feeling of describing a grave. This is what he's talking about. It's deep under the ground, and it feels like, but he cannot say what it is like. And the last challenge is the challenge of losing authorship because he didn't know anything. And this guy's testimony later on is all about his efforts to gain knowledge about what the Syrians are doing, about what he's going to go through, and this helps him to go through the captivity. The last analytic strategy I wish to briefly present is the holistic form analysis. In this analytic strategy, the focus is on the form of the whole narrative, the direction and the plot line takes. There are three basic narrative forms: progressive, regressive, and stable. Psychological literature and autobiographies portrays the Western model of men's life stories as a linear, ascending single plot line, with constant progress, independence, and successful agency. On the other hand, the cultural script of narrative form for physically or mentally sick people is that of deterioration or plateau. If this is the case, what are the cultural narrative options for these male veterans whose life path had been deterred by the trauma of war and captivity? In other words, we ask, what are the narrative forms of these life stories? It appears that the narrative forms in our sample do not obey any of the existing models for men's stories. They are complicated, incoherent, they include several paths instead of one linear path, and they do not progress on a single plot line. Narrators describe difficulties, constant coping with challenges and losses, as well as despair, but at the same time they also describe personal development, growth, hope, and satisfaction. In this manner, it might be that these men's trauma testimonies demonstrate a new form for the portrayal of Israeli men's lives, thus supplying alternative models for living and narrating life. To summarize, we found that narrators use different strategies to cope with the challenges they face due to the war in captivity. There are three concepts which capture the ongoing process of living and telling the trauma. Reminding, time and again to oneself and others, remembering. Through the memories and the process of remembering, the survivors connect themselves to their environments. Thus, they member themselves with others and restoring their lives. The story serves to restore and bring some order and hopefully peace in the survivor's life. These insights are limited due to the small sample size, and further research is needed to deepen our understanding. Some open questions and ideas for future research using this rich archive may include classifications and typologies of different traumatic events or different narrative types, studying the relations between the trauma narrative and the life story, and relations between testimony components and measures of well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rivka, for this special lecture.